Welcome to Brain Anatomy 101. As you can see here, we have a sheep brain, and we can tell that it's a sheep brain because we were told it was a sheep brain, and also because it's much smaller than our brain, and it has some features on it that are a little different than the human brain. Probably one of the more obvious features on the sheep brain, if I turn this over, we're looking at the ventral side of the sheep brain, or we could say this part is inferior to the other side that we just looked at, but ventral's good. And what we see here, where my finger is what we're seeing is the olfactory bulb, which is the center for in the brain for smell, and the sheep have a larger, more prominent olfactory bulb on this inferior or ventral part of the brain. Other things that we can note while we're on this side is we can see on this part right here, if I can keep this in the, kind of centered for you, is these optic tracts, which in this brain, this is the only brain that I could kind of put together and still look like a whole brain, forms a cross here coming from the retina of the eye, and it's called the optic chiasm. So it's a cross that goes right here, this white matter track that goes back. We can also see clearly on this side, we can see the brain stem. And the brain stem, it consists of three parts. This lower part that kind of starts where the spinal cord is and moves up to about here, kind of it's a long section called the medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata. And here we see the pons. Okay, so right here. And then just anterior to the pons, we run into an area that we know of as called the midbrain, which is easier to actually locate within the brain when we do a cut. Let's flip this back over. So now we're on the dorsal side of the brain, and we're looking now at the superior region, or the dorsal superior. We can use both. And on this side of the brain, what we note pretty clearly is, if I can put this back together, is that the brain is comprised of two large sides or hemispheres. Okay, so here's the right hemisphere, here's the left hemisphere, and those two hemispheres are actually divided by this midline that's kind of a deep groove called the medial longitudinal fissure. There are some other prominent features that we see. We see kind of this wavy stuff where we see areas that are coming up, some ridges here. And we call each of these individual ridges is called a gyri or gyrus, plural is gyri. And then where the ridges fold down and go on to the interior of the brain, those are called sulcus or sulci. So sulcus being singular, sulci plural. We are also able, if I put this back together while we're here, we can see also the brain can be looked at as a whole up here, like in sections. So when we look at both of these right and left hemispheres, what we're looking at in this whole area is the cerebral cortex. So as we're viewing it here, we're looking at the cerebral cortex. And then as we go down to the posterior caudal part of the brain, closer to the spinal cord, what we see is this structure here that has a lot of, whoops, that's really fuzzy. How can we get it a little clearer? Let's see if we can autofocus a little bit. Let's turn that autofocus on. Sorry. Let's see if we can get that to go on. There we go. Let's see if we get any better focus here. Autofocus, where are you? It's still not too focused, so let me try another tact here. Let's turn that off. See if we can focus it now. Maybe a little better. Yeah, it's actually actually a little better if I don't move too much. There we go. And so this right here is the part of the brain which is known as the cerebellum, involved with balance, coordination, and memory. This mid part, this part that's kind of sticking up on this, it's kind of this wormy-like structure coming right down the center. It's called the vermis. So we have the cerebellum with this midline area called the vermis. We have the cerebral cortex, divided into two hemispheres by the medial longitudinal fissure. We have a spinal cord down here, which is just at the tail, at the caudal end of this specimen. We have gyri, we have sulci, and we are going to take it from there. So for back here in the backside, we're looking at this area right back here as a lobe, and it has a functional relevance. So this part right back here is called the occipital lobe. It's involved in our primary visual processing. So that tells us, that implies it must be a secondary and other areas where vision is processed, but this is where vision is first processed. If we move up to here on either side, these are the parietal lobes, sometimes called the somatosensory cortex. These are the areas which are going to receive sensory information. It's also involved with memory and integration of information. As we go forward, or actually let's go sideways. So as we go here onto the side, we call this lobe the temporal lobe. On the some of this is involved with hearing. It's also involved with memory. So the temporal lobe is a critical area, but deeper in the brain, that is involved with memory. And then finally, where my fingers are, and I'm kind of poking up here, is our frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe, which is involved with planning, executive function, impulse control, and a variety of other things. When I'm looking at position, remember that anything that's sort of on this upper surface as we're looking at it would be considered anterior or I'm sorry, my bad, not anterior, superior or dorsal. Up here in the front, we'd say is anterior or rostral toward the nose. Back here, we'd say is posterior or caudal. We also can say that these, if we go from side to side, if we go away from this midline, either direction, we can say we're moving laterally, or we can move inward from that midline and we can say we're going medially. So this medial longitudinal fissure is located right in the center of the brain. It's medial to either of these hemispheres, so it's this big dividing line. All right, so last thing that we can talk about, we did we did anterior rostral, posterior caudal, superior or dorsal, and then the underside, which I'm not going to flip right now because I'm holding this brain together, would be the inferior or ventral. All right, so far so good. Now, we can also slice the brain, which we do to get into the interior and see the different structures. And there's 3 different planes at which we can slice the brain. We originally did right along this medial longitudinal fissure. We did what is called along the sagittal plane. So any cut that would be running in this direction is a sagittal cut. If we cut this direction, we're looking at a coronal cut, and that can mean all the way in either direction. And finally, if we cut like we're slicing here across the top and keep going down, 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 what we're looking at is a longitudinal or axial cut. So those are the 3 planes at which we can cut the sections of the brain, and we can take a look at that. Now, let's imagine that here we are with our scalpel, which you've already done, and we have cut through this medial longitudinal fissure. And what we've done is effectively create two mid-sagittal sections of the brain. So let's take a look at these on the interior. So there's a mid-sagittal section. Let's see if I can put this in a very central, actually maybe I'll do this one, central location so you can see it, if that's better. Let's see, I hope. All right. Well, this isn't quite as nice of a specimen as the one over there, so I may just start with this and then flip over to that. So one of the obvious things that you see when you open it up is you see that there's color differences, there's a little color change. So remember that this is all the cortex, and some of that cortex is folded in. Some of these gyri are actually now on the interior, right, as it's folded in. And what you see also, though, is that this is kind of pinkish or gray. But this part here is much lighter. So this is the white matter. White matter are the long axons, which is the kind of the fibers that work like communication lines between neurons and between parts of the brain. So this particular one right here is kind of like, it starts here like up at it's a little hook here, and then it continues down, and then it comes all the way down to the base like that. That's called the corpus, which means body, callosum. So the corpus callosum, we see it on both of these specimens on the right and left, are the fibers which cross over from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere and the left to the right. They're the axons that are communicating with the opposite side of the brain. Within the corpus callosum, not within it, but rather underneath it, is the space which is called the lateral ventricle. Above it, superior to it, so superior to the corpus callosum, we can say that this is called the cingulate gyrus. So it's one of those gyri, but it's kind of a large one and an important one that runs along the top of this corpus callosum. So that's the corpus callosum, and right above it is a gyrus called the cingulate gyrus. Very important communication area. Gray matter, white matter. Lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle is there's one on each side, so I'm going to switch to this part of the specimen. So you can see, I think, this one pretty well. Let's see if I can get that in a good position. So this too is the lateral ventricle. You can kind of see it as I put my probe right here, corpus callosum. And this right here is the cingulate gyrus. Normally this lateral ventricle has a little film over the top of it, a little bit of a division, which is actually, I'm going to switch again to this one, because here you can see it's still intact. So doesn't look like it's an open structure. It's because there's a little septum or a little tissue-like structure that separates it. So this is the septum pellucidum, which is just the covering, this light covering that kind of covers the right and the left ventricles, or the first and the second ventricles, to allow them to not leak into each other and to promote whatever circulation of what is inside here, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's part one, and we did a little bit of a review. I sense the bell will ring here in a minute and interrupt me. So what I'm going to do is pause it right here, and then I will pick that up where I left off. All right, cool. How can I do this? Stop. Hi. Hi.